Right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming this afternoon. This is the QRA James Croll Medal Award lecture, hosted by School of Geography and Environmental Science, University of Southampton. The QRA is the Quaternary Research Association, and we're an organisation that studies the last 2.6 million years, the Ice Age. And I'm the current president. So it gives me really great pleasure to invite our 2024 medal winner, Mary Edwards, to speak to us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks for coming, everyone. The QRA does excellent stuff. It supports young researchers, it gets people out into the field, promotes their work, and it runs an excellent journal too. So thank you, QRA, for this honour. Thank you, Jane, for this idea of giving a talk, because I wasn't able to show up at the meeting, and thanks, Justin, for facilitating this. When one thinks of James Croll and his achievements, this is truly humbling. So I am exceedingly honoured that you've given me this award. I'm going to start with a few comments about where this has come from. So motivation. There's going to be a lot about bridges in this talk, and not just any bridge. I walked across this for 5 days when I was attending the Geological Society meeting. It crosses the Allegheny in Pittsburgh, and it's the Rachel Carson Bridge. And she was one of Pittsburgh's very well-known daughters. And when I was in the sixth form at school, I read her book, Silent Spring. And it was a book that changed my life, because after I read it, I wanted to go and study ecology. If you haven't read Silent Spring, I strongly recommend it, but it's not an easy read. And the other motivation I want to mention is my mum, because when I was young, she took me out into the countryside. She knew the names of all the flowers. And when we went to the mountains on holiday, it was palpable how much she enjoyed being out in nature. And I think I must have inherited that. And she taught geography too. The other thing is I'm a child of the 60s and the 70s. And for me, there is no planet B. And these amazing early images from space exploration have stayed with me. When one first saw the Earth from space, it made a very, very big difference. And happy Earth Day for a couple of days ago, everybody. So there's my motivation. And my inspiration comes from very many people that I've met along the way. And I'm going to mention the chief mentors in my life. I started out at Aberystwyth studying ecology, and my tutor was Andrew Agnew, who made ecology so much fun. How could you not want to go on with it? I then went and studied forestry, and in the Forestry Institute, and thereby hangs a long tale about elephant logging in Sabah and all kinds of very strange things. But our forest economics lecturer said, I really think you ought to read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance if you haven't read it. Thank you, Philip. So John Burks was my supervisor at Cambridge. And from John, I learnt rigour, hard work, a love for the British flora, and that all forestry plantations in Britain were rubbish. And we had a lot of arguments in the little white van going to Wales to do the field work about this. And I'll come back to that in a moment. When I went on postdoc to University of Washington, Linda Brubaker was my postdoctoral supervisor. And from Linda, I learned some very important things. The first thing was it's a privilege to be able to do science. She used to say, we get paid to do this. It's fantastic. And the other thing that was very obvious with Linda was how much she cherished and promoted her postgraduate students and how proud she was of them. And the third mentor is Dave Hopkins, who will show up a lot in this talk. He was sadly a geologist who focused on, and you will hear more about this, Beringia and the Bering Land Bridge. He happened to be at University of Washington when I went there. He was organizing a book about the subject, and his enthusiasm was so infectious that he completely inveigled me into studying the Bering language, which I was already doing with Linda in the sense of going to Alaska, which was terribly exciting, and doing work on understanding the history of Alaska. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Scott, who's in the audience, my long-suffering partner, who's an excellent natural historian and took me on all kinds of adventures. If you're thinking about the rainforest, I'm not going to tell you about the tropics, but get him afterwards over the drinks and he'll tell you a lot about tropical rainforests, but always an inspiration. So what am I going to talk about? I've got a kind of circular dipping structure here. This lovely photograph was taken by a friend of mine from Alaska. It's Jessica Whiteside and me doing something on a lake, of which one does a lot if one does paleoecology. So I'm going to start with the temperate rainforest, and that will take us to Wales and Norway and a discussion of biodiversity. This is the early stuff that I did. And cultural landscapes, and then move on to the north, where I've done most of my work. And most of you know me that I work in Alaska and Siberia. And so we're going to talk about Beringia and the land bridge, and bridges in all kinds of senses between North America and Russia. I want to talk a bit about thawing in Alaska, because the north is thawing at a dramatic rate now under global warming, but it's actually been thawing for some time. And then we'll cross the land bridge and find out something about what the mammoths ate, which is what you all want to know, I'm sure. And finally, I'm going to talk about another bridge that we made, this time using science diplomacy. So let's start in the temperate rainforests of Britain. These have become quite well publicized recently, and there are groups active in trying to conserve and restore these tiny fragments of rainforest. This is a picture of the Rhinogs in North Wales, and a couple of pictures, one by John, of these little tiny fragments of woodland which contain an amazingly rich flora, particularly mosses, liverworts, and lichens. And they were identified in the 70s by Derek Radcliffe, who was the author of Nature Conservation Review, as being very, very special habitats. Nobody noticed them, nobody heard of them at this time, and they still didn't really take any notice of them. But unbelievably rich, and Derek Radcliffe's idea was these could be pristine fragments of, in a sense, the old wild wood. And John had the bright idea of sending me off to study them. So this is a new group that's studying the lost rainforest of Britain. The climate map is basically just a rainfall map. It's a bit geographically restricted because Ireland's not in there, but Ireland should be covered in this kind of purple color as well. And the idea is it's so wet that the humid atmosphere allows this very, very special flora and associated fauna, obviously, to exist. On the right is the reality of where this group has found elements of that flora and suggested there could be woods. There are very few that are larger than a postage stamp, quite honestly. This is a highly fragmented type of habitat, and the little star up at the top here is the one I'm just going to tell you about. So with John, we applied paleoecology, just 1,000 years worth of record to this site. And what we found was there may be a wonderful flora in this wood, but the trees have been cut down. And I found documentary evidence of this. There's pollen evidence of this. These big scoops in the record show where the trees were cut down and allowed to regrow again. And the thing was, though, as time went on, the little coloured splodges here show that we went from a really quite diverse wood of different kinds of trees to something that was basically an oak wood. And that's what they look like now. So the verdict of this was, yes, they're wonderful habitats. No, they're not pristine. No, they're not wildwood. The flora exists because these are the wettest places with waterfalls and little rivers and places that keep it wet. Actually, this is marginal habitat for this kind of wood. So that was a cultural landscape created by millennia of sheep grazing and the gradual attrition of the woodlands that once covered North Wales. Later in my career, Scott and I both ended up in mid-Norway, and I was in the geography department at Trondheim, and it was full of landscape geographers. Those are a rare breed in Britain, but the idea was to study that cultural landscape. And Gunhild and Carolina and I are here at her dad's Feta, the summer farm, where people would bring the animals up in the summer. And these upland farm landscapes were recognized for being very rich in diversity, lots of different plants growing in these grazed habitats. So we did a lot of work with students and all kinds of things studying this landscape. And after a while, it put me in mind that we've actually got two different cultural landscapes, Wales and Norway. In Norway, when the oil came, the farmers said, oh, we don't have to go to the uplands. We can buy stuff in the supermarket. We can have a nice improved pasture down here. Norway went from being a very poor European country to a very rich one. We don't need the setters anymore. Let's just abandon them. If you turn round from that view, this is what you see. The forest is coming back. It's growing all over the mountains where the setters have been abandoned. Interestingly, there's quite a lot of concern because the forest is kind of taking over these cultural landscapes. And perhaps the idea in Norway is that some setters should be maintained, even if it's only to bring tourists in, so that these special patches of cultural land can be retained as the wildwood kind of re-establishes itself. In Wales, it doesn't quite work like that, because what's happening, or what's happened in Wales, is the countryside is covered by this stuff. And this is what John and I used to get into arguments about. And I said, well, we've got to have forestry, we need wood. And he said, but this stuff's sterile. And he's quite right. It's complete rubbish to grow. This is Sitka spruce. Now, I've seen real Sitka spruce, and this is not it. And this is not what we need in the Welsh uplands. Actually, you just leave the Welsh uplands and they do what Norway would do if you took the sheep off. But in both cases, there are different groups of people valuing this landscape differently. The farmers have different views about it. Amenity users have different views about it. And sadly, what's going on now is companies that think they can greenwash us by buying up this upland landscape and planting it with confidence and saying, we're sequestering carbon, look at what a great job we're doing, are not doing any good to biodiversity at all. So this is sort of the story about fragmented landscapes, fragmented habitats, policy. But I think with these fragmented landscapes, right here in Hampshire or the Isle of Wight, we can actually do something about working with local groups to join up bits of habitat, to bring the habitats that are being restricted by cultural use and agriculture everywhere, and start joining them up again to the benefit of the plants and animals that live in them. So I think there's a lot of positive things that we can do. But also while I was in Norway, the same group of us and some others, including Scott, went to Madagascar. There's a big connection between Norway and Madagascar. There's a lot of kind of diplomatic and scientific exchange. If anybody wants to guess which one's Scotland in this case, and which one's Madagascar, you can have a guess, the top two pictures. Scott's not allowed to answer this. What put me in mind of this was a paper that we read where somebody said, do you know Madagascar has got this fragmented forest? And it's really awful. We want to try and figure out how far animals or plants can disperse between fragments. But it's very hard to study in Madagascar. We're going to use Scotland as an analogue for Madagascar. And if you look at these two shots below, one is Scotland, one is Madagascar. And again, it's this story of fragmentation of the original type of habitat to tiny, tiny bits. This is actually the history of Wisconsin, this one here, so I should be pointing for my guests online. But it makes the point. Over 200 years, the woods of Wisconsin turned into this one on the bottom right. And this is basically what we've got both in Madagascar and in Wales and in Scotland. We've got this massively fragmented landscape. So if we, this one is Madagascar. The red soil, as Scott would say, gives it away. And here's a view of what we see on the ground here in Madagascar, and it's tiny fragments of forest. And in the case of conservation biology, what's the minimal viable patch size for something like the brown lemur, one of the many lemurs nowhere else in the world? A whole suite of about 100 species counted now that only live in Madagascar. Why is this landscape the way it is? It's partly because of burning for cattle. So cattle ranching or cattle grazing is a major concern, and much of the land has been, or much of the forest has been lost. So with wonderful students, Jürgen and the postdoc Bertrand and student Ingvild, and with our colleague Joël in France, we went to study this landscape, and the biologists were out trying to figure out, is there something we can do to join up these patches to make the habitat patches bigger? And because I joined the geography department, was full of landscape geographers and development geographers, I became a social scientist, or I became a human geographer for a few years, sort of. And Bertrand and Jürgen and Ingvild did wonderful work looking at what was going on. And any conservation biologist who works in the less economically developed countries will tell you this all the time. It's a nightmare of different things. So there's poor governance, there's corruption, there's nobody really in charge. There are conflicts between local people and inappropriately imposed land laws. This is part of the inheritance of the aftermath of French colonial rule, with one system imposed from the center and another one trying to work in a traditional way underneath it. People blamed for deforestation and burning had nothing to do with it. Actually, the people that burn this landscape is the big rich guys who own cattle herds and who live in the capital city. And so it's a real mess. And as I say, anybody working in tropical conservation will tell you these are the complexities that have to be dealt with all the time. I don't really have a happy ending for this story. It's very difficult to push against this sort of tidal wave going in the opposite direction. But ironically, those people who've been, in this case, in the villages nearby, who've been blamed for all this and didn't do it, ironically, they've been given all kinds of plantations that were put in the wrong place, and they had to take them down because that was going to cause a fight between people about land. Really, what they wanted was a bridge. They wanted a bridge over the river that flooded their ford every rainy season, so they got cut off for months at a time, but nobody really asked them that. So with that, I'm going to let you take a breath and kind of just think a little bit. We're going to move north, and if anybody is wondering, that's very close to Fairbanks, up on the mountains there, looking north. You basically probably could just, as a raven, fly north and get to the Arctic coast, and you wouldn't see anybody probably. So this, unlike the cultural landscapes of Britain and Europe and Madagascar, this is as close you get to wilderness and pristine as it comes in most places in the world. What my experience in Madagascar taught me, and what experiences in Alaska have taught me, is that actually science can be viewed very much as a colonial enterprise. And when I was working in an area in Alaska, and I took Dave Hopkins down with me, and we were poking around, and at that time you could get a helicopter for like a couple of shillings and it would drop you off somewhere, and we've been poking around. We got all permissions from the government to go there, but we hadn't been to the village. And a guy came from the village, and we sat down and we had innumerable cups of coffee and a very long conversation about why hadn't we told them that we were doing this, and what have we found, and what about the peregrine falcons that nested on the cliff? Well, they weren't there then, but they did come back later and cause problems for other trips. And it was a real eye-opener to think, gosh, yeah, how arrogant we are. We just go in there and we do this stuff, and so things have changed a lot since then. But yes, science itself can be a little bit of a problem for the local people. Anyway, with that slightly sobering sort of philosophical comment, here is the Bering Land Bridge. It joins Alaska and northeast Siberia. During the Ice Age, when there was a lot of ice on the land and the ocean levels had dropped by over 100 meters, the shallow Bering Strait and Chukchi Sea became dry land. And this lovely map by Geoffrey Bond, which has just been published, it's just a beautiful map. It shows where the ice was, more or less, and where it wasn't, where there were lakes, and where there was a huge land mass. And this famous land bridge, it was where people came across from Asia, walked across the land bridge, and many of the mammals exchanged between Africa and Asia, the ones that are iconic for the Ice Age, like the mammoths and the bison and the horses and all the rest of it. Well, it became a sea, the Bering Sea became a sea about 11,000 years ago, and everything went along. And then just a couple of centuries ago, the Russians were the first Europeans to come into Alaska because of the fur trade. And the Russian culture is still evident on the west coast of Alaska. There's the famous Alaska Purchase, where Russia sold Alaska to the United States for about $8 million. And sort of the rest is history. But again, there was a period of new colonialism in Alaska at that time. But what I like is the way the land bridge on the one side here, we have Seward Peninsula, and the other have Chukotka Peninsula. And it's like they're reaching out to shake hands. And so this is the place where Asia meets North America. And Dave Hopkins knew that. And he knew there was a shared history. And he knew very excellent Russian scientists were studying this stuff, or I should say, Soviet scientists were studying stuff. And he made great efforts to contact people. And one of the people he contacted was the chap on the left, André Scheer, who had learned English in night school because he knew it was going to be important for his science. And he and Dave just hit it off and became firm friends and organized all kinds of things, even before the Soviet Union finally disappeared, in terms of exchanges, scientific exchanges. And I'm going to come back to that early period towards the end of the talk. But it set in motion wonderful exchanges, particularly between the Alaskan universities and the Alaskan public of all kinds between the two. When Glasnost happened, it was absolutely amazing. So the Bering Land Bridge and the Bering Strait and James Croll. So James Croll, as I learned by reading, embarrassingly, I know about his Ice Age orbital theories, but not that he was very interested in what the ocean could do for climate. And the Bering Land Bridge and the Bering Strait, this flipping between the land and the sea, makes a great difference to the climate of both sides of the Bering Land Bridge. There's much speculation about how important it was, because people like Linda and myself, who were studying vegetation history, knew things changed dramatically, but we weren't sure what the cause was. And one of the neat things about what we do is we work with climate modelers, and climate modelers who have an interest in the past run paleo climate models. And this particular panel is part of a project that was a brainchild of Bart Line at the University of Oregon. And Bart himself is a kind of intellectual bridge, because he understands about the models, but he also understands about the kind of thing that Linda and I do, and he brings them together in really very, very creative ways. And this is an experiment in a model to find out what happens when you flood the land bridge. And basically, you can see that the red color on the top right is about flooding the land bridge and making the ocean a more important element of the climate of Alaska. And it warms up in winter. Interestingly, it warms up in winter because though there's some ice, there's also some ocean there as well. And in the summer, the bottom right, you've put ocean everywhere. And now the land is warmer than the ocean, so the ocean acts as a cooling effect. And so actually a lot of things happen about the time the Bering Land Bridge is broken that show up in the history of the vegetation and other elements of the Alaskan environment and climate. So James Croll, I hope that took your fancy. One other thing I'm going to throw in here is a bit more of the climate history of Alaska so that things I talk about in a moment make sense. This is Birch Lake. Birch Lake is the most cored and studied lake in Alaska, possibly because it's only 45 minutes down the road from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Tom Ager in the 1970s did his thesis partly on this site. Nancy Bigelow did her thesis in the 90s partly on the site, and it's probably been cored, I don't know, 20 or 30 times at least. And one of the things that it has is a wonderful signature, and I wish all diagrams could be as sort of elegant as this one. This is Birch Lake's story in a couple of squiggles, which is that it starts out by being dry about 15,000 years ago, and it then fills with water in a kind of wiggly kind of way until it goes up to its current really high level. And this was a project done with Mark Abbott and Bruce Finney and others, and it was the first lake level record from Alaska. If you think about the temperature at the time, kind of draw a rough line through this signature, and you get an increasing temperature. And there's stuff going on here, and this stuff going on here is about the time of the land bridge opening. There are other major causes of why this is the way it is. But one of the things is this lake was dry. To get this lake dry, you have to reduce the precipitation in Alaska maybe as much as 50%. It was an absolute desert at this time in this part of the world. So there's a little bit of history there, Birch Lake. So another kind of bit of background before we plunge into some stories about Alaska is permafrost. As you can see, both Alaska and Siberia are underlain by permafrost. Permafrost has an active layer, and underneath that active layer that may be 50 centimeters or a meter thick is perennially frozen ground. That can often contain ice. The ice is often in the form of wedges that snake under the ground, and they form this kind of thermodynamically efficient pattern of polygons. So ice wedge polygons tell you for sure there's ice and permafrost under your landscape. And of course, this ice can melt, and this is a lot of what's going on with the thawing of Alaska. So here we have Alaska, and we're going to talk about a phenomenon called thaw lakes, which is one of Dave's favorite subjects, and he actually wrote the paper about it that said, if you warm it up or make it wet, and somehow the land gets maybe a bit disturbed or something, the warmth and the moisture will cause the ice underneath it to melt, and it will make a hole in the ground, and the hole in the ground will fill with water. And he called that a thaw lake. And if we go to the northern part of Alaska here and look in detail at that landscape, this is a landscape of lots and lots of lakes. They may be a kilometer long or so, not quite as wide. They're all oriented. That's a curious thing in itself. They may be 2 meters deep, 3 meters deep. And they've all formed by the ice wedges under the ground, thawing out and making shallow ponds. And one thing to think about this landscape is, if you wanted to cross it in summer, you couldn't, quite frankly. But in winter, you can go anywhere on this landscape because it's completely frozen, and we'll come back to that. If we look just here at the coast of this landscape, we find the coast is eroding, and it's eroding very rapidly. Here is a nice illustration of the sideways kind of line of an ice wedge. Here's the ice wedge here. And here's everything falling into the sea. You can see how the sea is undercutting here into the ice, which just melts as soon as it comes in contact with seawater. And what's happening here is not only is it just the sea eroding the ice, it's the long period of time where there is no ice now on this part of the Arctic Ocean because the ice is retreating. Storms whip up, the waves get a high fetch, and the erosion is increasing very rapidly. And what we're finding in Alaska is this speeded up erosion is actually taking out the villages that lie along this Arctic coast, and they're having to be relocated inland. And this is some of the first basic climate change refugee relocations going on in the north. And there's just a diagram to show you this lovely kind of tool. You can pick up all the Arctic ice extents as they unfold during a year, with the minimum in September. This is the 2012 absolute minimum. The other colored lines here are the last 5 years. So it's a big trend towards less and less ice along the coast, more coastal erosion, more disruption to the villages along the coast. So the other place in Alaska that I wanted to talk about is the one with the yellow square. This is in the center of Alaska, in the valley of the Yukon River. And when you fly over it, it's a very odd landscape. It's completely covered in trees. You just get the sense that somebody's kind of ruffled the bedspread on this landscape. And of course, it's peppered with lakes. And one time I flew across it with Dave and he said, "Do you think those are Thaw lakes?" I said, "I don't know, but we could try and find out." So what Dave didn't get to see about this landscape, and boy, would he have liked it, is the fact that if you put a LiDAR image on it and get rid of the trees, yeah, I'd say this landscape has been undergoing some thaw. I mean, these are fantastic. You know, there are runnels coming into this lake. It's broken out. It's drained into this lake. This lake drained and drained down there into the valley. And all these wrinkles are where the land has been flowing. It's a very loose cover of silt, of loess. It had ice in it, but it's been melting. It's been melting ever since Birch Lake started to experience warming and wetting of the landscape. We went to this lake here and did a bit of paleoecology on it. And what we're looking for is what happens when a lake forms. What's at the bottom of a lake? Let's imagine a landscape, whether it's got forest or shrubs or something on it, and the ice starts to collapse, the land falls in. You're going to get all kinds of stuff. You're going to get leaves, twigs, heaven knows what, falling into the bottom of the lake. If we look at this picture here, we can see, this is a picture that my colleague, friend Katie took. It's a thaw lake in Russia, actually, there, over on the other side too. And you can see the way the tumbly edges of the lake gradually expands and eats away at its edges and everything falls in. If you can find the central bit where it started and date that with radiocarbon, you get the approximate age that the lake started. And so this thing called the highly technical basal trash layer is where that lake initially collapsed and started to form. And it happened around maybe about 12 or 13,000 years ago, just as Birch Lake is starting to show change in the regional climate. So one can get these dates from stratigraphic sections and other lakes, and the Russians have done a lot of this work and dated where these lakes have appeared basically in a section where rivers cut through a lake, it's drained, and you see the bottom of the lake. And so you can find out when all these lakes began. And here's a bit of serendipity, and serendipity underlies science quite a bit. This is my friend and colleague Katie Walton. We met at a conference, and she said, "Do you know what thaw lakes are?" And I said, "Yes, I do know what thaw lakes are." And she said, "Great." And her story is that she'd been observing methane coming out of the thaw lakes because the microbial processes happening during thaw caused methane to be released. And she thought there was a lot of it going on. And so I said, well, we could actually do this through time. So what we did was we gathered all the possible radiocarbon dates at the beginnings of thaw lakes, put them on another highly technical graph, as you can see here, looked at the way the landscape on which thaw lakes could form changed during the warming period at the end of the Ice Age, and then did a wonderful back of the envelope calculation about how much methane might have been coming out. And it sort of looks like this, which interestingly mirrors the global methane record for the time of warming after the Ice Age. And the conclusion was that in this early time, when Alaska was beginning basically to melt after the Ice Age, these thaw lakes were contributing quite a lot to the northern methane production. And that was a really fun, completely serendipitous piece of work that came about. Now, Katie went on to show that if global warming continues, these thaw lakes are going to produce more and more methane. This is one of the classic IPCC type diagrams that shows you under the most optimistic scenario, the Arctic gets about 4 degrees warmer by the end of the century. And under the pessimistic scenario, heaven knows what's going on. It's somewhere up about 10 degrees, which would be unbelievably catastrophic. What is there now? This little diagram here was a paper done by Teresa Smetkova and Jadu, and I had a bit to do with it. And it's about observing with imagery how quickly the ice is disappearing from lakes in the spring. And even over a relatively short period of time, the significant changes in how long the ice lasts on lakes. And so we've got a very rapidly warming landscape, and we've got the ice lasting for less time on both the ocean and on the lakes. And what implications does this have for, well, this is actually Siberia, and some of you may have seen this. This is the absolutely extraordinary Batagayaka chasm that opened up over about 50 years in Siberia because somebody did something a little bit foolish up on the top of this hill, disturbed the land, and the whole thing caved in. It's a giant thermokarst collapse feature. That back cliff is about 80 meters high. So this sort of thing is happening in a small scale now all around the permafrosted Arctic. And in Alaska, this kind of early ice out is affecting the economy. It's affecting everybody who's trying to cross those landscapes on a snowmobile to get to a hunting camp or whatever. And it's affecting ice road truckers as well. And there have been trucks that have gone through thin ice, and the ice is getting more unreliable all the time. So this is the North thawing, kind of as we observe it to be happening. So now I'm going to go across the Bering land bridge, and we'll end up in the Kolyma region of Russia. This is the Kolyma River. It rises near Magadan and goes down towards the coast at Chersky. This is a closed region in the time of the Soviet Union, and we'll get to that more later. It's the Sakha Republic is inhabited by the Sakha people who are pastoralists, but they have horses, not reindeer. And it's a very interesting and quite powerful community because it's an autonomous republic, and they have quite a lot of say in how they run the Sakha Republic. This is near the mouth of the Kolyma River. This is the location of the Chersky village and the Chersky field station, and more about what that was like in the past in a moment. Now it's a little bit sad. We can think about somebody applying a ligature and gradually squeezing the life out of the east end of Russia. That seems to be what's happening. People used to come to Chersky because it was free. You could say what you wanted and nobody cared. Moscow didn't care. Now Moscow just wants to be rid of the burden of places like this. But this guy here is quite famous. He's called Sergei Zimov, and you might have heard of him in connection with something called Pleistocene Park. He's a complete iconoclast. He's one of a kind. He has a whole range of equipment that he's obtained over the ages. Nobody bothers him. He runs a field station, does what he wants. And I've been there a couple of times, and it's an absolutely amazing place. It's on the Kolyma River, which is big and deep and wide. The banks of the Kolyma, we'll come to in a minute, often look like this, which is a bit messy. And here's Julian Merton standing on the top of the cliff making notes, and we'll come back to what Julian was up to in a moment. So I just want to introduce you to that murky, messy cliff that we saw a picture of. Now this is an ice wedge. This ice wedge is probably 20 or 30 meters deep, and it sneaks down through this unconsolidated material, which is windblown silt, basically piling up layer on layer through time and forming a very simple kind of soil. And we'll see in a moment, this is the kind of landscape the mammoths walked across. If you want to envision what this is like, the cheese is the ice, the holes are the silt. It's 70, 80, often % ice. So if you think about exposing this to the air and the rain for a moment, it collapses very, very rapidly. It is that landscape, which is now being cut by the Kolyma River, that these guys lived on. Not quite like this. This is one of the less fantastical representations of that megafauna that lived from Siberia to Alaska across the Bering Land Bridge, including the mammoths. And the big question is, what did they eat? When it was so cold and so dry, what did they eat? Were they eating tundra plants? Was it more like the Mongolian steppes? Was it something in between? And lots of arguments about it. It's never been settled. So about 15 years ago, somebody had the bright idea of looking at ancient DNA. This was an up-and-coming thing that one could do. DNA is preserved particularly in frozen materials. And when you think about who walked across this, we've got the animals walking across it, we've got plants growing on it, and you can climb up this stuff and into these residual silt heaps amongst the ice wedges, and you can find the frozen DNA. And what's amazing is that a stratigrapher like Julian Merton or my friend Pat McDowell, with whom I worked on this stuff in Alaska, to me it looks like a pile of dirt, could see how this formed and the kinds of different levels in this, the ancient soils and other intervening things. And basically, a very, very large team of people got a bunch of DNA out of it. The mammal bones come out of the cliff the whole time. And interestingly also come out mummies, particularly baby mammoths that maybe haven't quite got it sorted and fall in somehow or get stuck. And this is Dima, the first scientifically studied baby mammoth mummy, studied by my friend Anatoly Loshkin. Anyway, these things fall out of the cliffs too. So you can imagine there's a lot of animal DNA in the cliffs. And this big study, led by Eski Villeslev, who's also one of a kind, showed what the mammoths ate. And interestingly, the proportion of grasses, which we might associate with steppe, and forbs, which is sort of the other things that have, you know, typically have flowers, it was very, very different from what would previously been thought. And these two graphs up here show that kind of thing for periods when these animals were alive and well and living on this landscape. These are interesting because these are coprolites. So this is animal dung preserved in the permafrost. And again, it shows what the animals eat. And I do think the ancient DNA had a really profound influence on what people think about what this landscape looked like. It's a highly informative thing. This big study, it was the biggest project I've ever been in, and it was tumultuous at times. There were lots of arguments and standoffs, but some wonderful times. I mean, any project that gets you to go in to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg and then a nightclub in St. Petersburg that night, which was really very interesting, can't be all of a bad project. And we did get wonderful stuff out of it. But I must say that later, working with Inge Alsos in Tromsø and Pete Heinzman, on a slightly smaller scale of DNA discovery, I think we did some really super work as well. So I'm just going to stop for a moment. We're coming pretty close to the end of my story, but I do want to tell a story. When I put this talk together, I realized I'd had thousands of pictures and they weren't organized to tell this kind of story. And after a while, I took whatever pictures I could see, which is why they're slightly random. And the ones of my first trip to Russia in 1990 got burned in a fire. We won't go there, but I don't have them. But it was an amazing trip because it was the first trip that the institute in Moscow had been able to take out to Chersky with no KGB minder. And 6 people from America went with them. No KGB minder. It was a big party. It was a big holiday. They got on the plane. Everybody got out things to drink and eat. We flew across for hours across Siberia and ended up in Chersky. And we went up the Kolyma and we lived up there. And we ate a lot of mushrooms, perfectly normal mushrooms. A lot of strange things that came out of tins that could have been meat. And it was fantastic. And the people were great. And we found all kinds of stuff. And Sergei Zimov has a hovercraft. He had a hovercraft back then. It was his pride and joy. It was called the Leopard. And he said, I have a hovercraft. Have you ever been in a hovercraft? I said, yes. And he was so crestfallen. Actually, I grew up on the Isle of Wight, where they invented hovercrafts and make them. Oh. Anyway, we went for a nice ride in the hovercraft. We did various things. Coming back down to leave Chesky, we came down the river in his wonderful barge, and we'd all had a toast. You always have to have a toast. And Masha, you should drive the barge. So here I'm going, okay. They put me on a crate of the stuff that the odd meat stuff came in. I'm driving the barge down. We got down to Chesky. I got off, unloaded our stuff, and Sergei went buzzing off in his hovercraft. I think he was glad to be rid of us, and he went off and did a bit of playing around with the hovercraft. And he came back a couple of hours later, and his face was very serious, and he said, "I've got something to show you." And I didn't take a picture of this when I saw it. It was a mummy. He had a mummy on the front of his hovercraft. And it was a human mummy. Luckily, it didn't have a head. That had become disarticulated, but it had come out the bottom of the cliff on the river. It was wearing knitted woolen clothing. And we all sort of looked at each other and we said, yes, it's somebody from the camps. Because the Colomar was a closed area because it was where the camps were, the prison camps. And if we think about this person, this very small person, who'd somehow escaped and walked through that landscape, and sort of somehow probably maybe died on the way, maybe suffered the fate of the baby mammoths that fell down the cliff, and then had come out again at the bottom. And it was a reminder that Russia doesn't have a happy past, particularly in that part of the world. So my last story actually starts in Magadan, which is the port that people came into if they were being shipped to the camps down the Kolyma River. And this is a memorial to the camps, rather fetching and affecting memorial to the people who lived in the camps. And this is Magadan, which has 2 scientific institutes with excellent scientists in them. And basically, this is about the last bridge I'm going to tell you about, which is a scientific bridge. And it's called the Dima Project, after the baby mammoth and Anatoly Loshkin, who found the mammoth. But it starts 10 years earlier. On and off, I've collaborated with Colin Prentice and Sandy Harrison. Anybody in Quaternary knows these people. They do a wonderful job in all kinds of ways, particularly linking models with data and testing climate models' ability to post-dict what happened in the past and do our data match the models. And there were an awful lot of workshops that one attended, and this was one that we did here in Southampton. Most of these people are Russian colleagues. Here is Pat Anderson, my colleague from way back, and Anatoly Loshkin, who've worked together for a long time, working on Russian paleohistory. And here is Heather, the most praiseworthy postdoc, who sadly, I believe, decided that the reason that she wore spectacles now was because of all the data she had to analyze for our project. So I'm sorry about that, Heather, but Heather was fantastic at organizing all this stuff. We had a wonderful meeting. We made all these friends. And a little while, well, about 10 years later, Anatoly said, look, we can't get new stuff. We can't get new software. We've got young people that want to do work. Could you come and bring some programs with you and show us how to use them, and we can do much better stuff? And so we did. So we did the Dima project, and we went out to Magadan in 2018. We, being Martin van Hardenbroek, and I, who has been a colleague for the past 10 or so years, an absolutely dynamic person. We organized the first trip out there. Pat's there, Anatoly's there, and so are the young students who wouldn't get the chance to travel. We took Eric Grimm, who was a wonderful paleoecologist, gave about, I don't know, 15 copies of his $200 value program to us to take to Russian scientists, the different institutes, so they could do the analysis. It was wonderful. And my little slide there says, why are we here? People, connections. It's important science. It's the land bridge. Let's build on our mutual interests. We had a great time. We had a second workshop in Tomsk, where Martin took everybody to Kora Lake, showing that we could do this and get some really great kind of short-term data on changes in lakes. And everybody was terribly enthusiastic. And then they all came over to Southampton in 2019. And we'd arranged workshops, we'd arranged projects, excuse me, and student exchanges that were going to happen the following year. And then COVID hit and everything closed down. And by the time COVID finished, it was 2022. And I just can't say how awful it is, what has happened geopolitically, really, in that intervening time. I don't know if I'm ever going to see any of these people again. Several of them have left Russia and they've gone to China. Maybe if I go to China, I'd see them. And I do think it's such a sad end to what was a wonderful, it was a very quiet piece of science diplomacy. To do all this, we were funded by the Foreign Office to basically go and make friends with Russian scientists and set up cooperative activities between the UK and Russia. We went on Russian TV. It was fantastic. And I mean, there's still plenty in the world to do, but I really miss my Russian colleagues and being able to do more than just have a Zoom meeting with them occasionally. And we're struggling to produce some of the work that we started, but it's hard going. But I don't want to end on a sad note, but it's the reality of the world, and it certainly hit Martin and myself very hard. So really, the last thing I want to do, because it's time to stop, is to go back to Linda's point about how one's students, well, back to sort of the idea of a family. I don't know if I actually said at the very beginning, when I introduced John and Linda and Dave, what I meant to say was, if you go to a village in Alaska, you introduce yourself, you tell them who your family is and where you came from. In a sense, John and Linda and Dave are my scientific family. They're sort of the ancestors. And of course, what your students are the descendants. And so they are terribly important, as Linda pointed out. And random photographs, you may be in it, you may not, but whoever you are, my students, you're cherished, just as Linda said. And hard work going on here in the woods, equally hard work obviously going on here. Here's the Costa del Fairbanks, lovely spot. The fishing, quite good, quite a nice place to go fishing, I'd say. And of course, huskies. And this is Nancy, who was first student, then postdoc, then colleague, then director of the Alaska Quaternary Center, and Andy, who was our super technician. And what I want to say is I do value both the students and the technicians who underpin such a lot of the work that we do. Now, Paul Hughes and Ali Monteith and Charlotte Clark and I were in Alaska after a very convoluted and adventurous field season. It was our last night in town. We went to the fair. There's a wonderful fair in August. And we went around the fair, and I remember Charlotte having a hug-in with a giant husky that was about 6 foot tall, and its zips showed, but she liked hugging it anyway. And we went and had our photos taken in the booth, where you can get a photo taken and you make a fridge magnet out of it. And we went up onto the hill above Fairbanks, the picture I showed you. I think Paul and Ali and I were looking at the sunset, maybe, and Charlotte was off talking to people. And she'd been telling them what she'd been doing, and they said to her, "How nice that your brother and your parents are helping you do your field work." And so here's the paleo family. And with that, thanks very much for listening.
Yeah, I think we've got time for quick questions. If anyone's got any questions, has anyone got any questions?
I can try to answer questions. I've talked about a lot of stuff I don't know much about, but
are there any questions online? How would we find out?
Oh, how do you do questions online? I know. I'm going to get rid of this. No. Yes, people? No?
The second tab is the teams. Is the color tab across teams?
Oh, at the top. Yeah, is that one? The second. That's it. Yeah.
Voila, people. Yes, look at all those people. They probably don't want to ask anything.
Are there any questions online? Or?
I think the chat has some red block in there.
The chat. Oh yeah, the chat button. That's it. Yeah. Thank you. Oh yeah.
Oh, lots of nice things. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah. Not questions. Just
No. Just don't ask me what I think about Putin. That's all right. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have a favorite location?
What?
Do you have a favorite location for somewhere?
Oh, do I have a favourite location? Birch Lake, of course. Oh, and I didn't tell you about the field croquet. Andy, the super technician, perfected the game of field croquet. It involves a small croquet set, a very bumpy pitch, and lots of gin and tonic. Excellent.
Oh, we've got a question from the audience there.
Hi.
I was the voice of the just a quick, I hope it's political correct to ask what is next for you now?
Yes, it's a fine question to ask. Actually, I want to go back to the Welsh woods because now people know what they are and there's still stuff to do. And as Paul knows, I've got a 40-year-old record of stuff that was in those woods. I think I've forgotten what they all look like, but I'm sure I can learn it again. And I really would like to go back and see how they change it and link up with these guys that are trying to, do something about the temperate rainforest. And the other thing that may or may not come off is somebody who somehow I think didn't get named and should have done in this talk. My colleague Julie Brigham-Gretty, who one of the things that Dave Hopkins was excellent at was promoting and helping young researchers. And he really did try and do stuff for young researchers. And he did it. My colleague Julie Brigham-Gretty, who was here, some of you may remember, gave a wonderful talk about Lake E that goes back 3 million years into the Pleistocene, the Gregory lecture. And I went to visit her a couple of weeks ago, and we've got a plan. Julie calls it our swan song. And it's to core a very deep lake in Alaska. It won't be 3 million years old. And it might be 300,000 years old. We'll see. So that is the answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, well, it gives me great pleasure now. Thank you for that fantastic talk of giving you the medal. It's actually a medal.
It's a real medal.
So, and Sally's going to take
okay.
a photo. It'll be okay here. Or yeah. Right. Okay.
Right.
There you are. And now we've got drinks outside, so please join us.
My dad used to say, take a medal, mate. And I'm not sure he meant it quite like get a medal, but maybe he was pleased. I don't know.